There is a strange moment that happens when a conversation suddenly goes quiet. Someone asks a question, you answer, and then nothing, no response, no smile, no little joke to fill the space. Just silence, and almost immediately you feel the urge to do something about it. You explain yourself, you ask another question, you make a joke, you reach for your phone. Anything to make the silence disappear. But why? Why can a few seconds of silence feel more uncomfortable than an argument? Why do some people become visibly restless when nobody is talking? And why does silence sometimes reveal more about a person than their words ever could? The interesting thing is, silence itself isn't usually the problem. It's what silence forces us to notice. When there are no words between two people, there is suddenly nowhere for the mind to hide. You become aware of the other person's expression, your own thoughts, the tension in the room. The possibility that something is wrong, and sometimes, you become aware of yourself. That is where silence becomes psychologically powerful. Because when conversation stops, the mind doesn't necessarily become quiet. It often becomes louder. Imagine sitting across from someone you care about. A few minutes earlier, everything felt normal. You were talking, laughing, exchanging stories. Then you say something slightly personal. They don't respond immediately. They just look at you. 3 seconds pass, then 5. And suddenly your mind starts working. Did I say something wrong? Are they angry? Did that sound strange? Do they disagree with me? Should I explain what I meant? The other person hasn't actually done anything, but your brain has already started creating a story. That's one of the first reasons silence can feel uncomfortable. Silence creates uncertainty. And human beings don't particularly enjoy uncertainty. When information is missing, the mind tries to fill the gap. Sometimes it fills that gap with reality, sometimes it fills it with fear. And sometimes, it fills it with whatever story we've already learned to believe about ourselves. If you secretly worry that people don't like you, silence can feel like rejection. If you fear conflict, silence can feel like anger. If you need reassurance, silence can feel like abandonment. If you're used to being judged, silence can feel like criticism. The silence hasn't said any of those things, your mind has, and that's a subtle distinction that can change the way you understand people, because two people can experience the exact same silence and feel completely different things. One person might think this is peaceful, another might think something is wrong, one might enjoy the quiet. Another might desperately search for something to say. So when someone becomes uncomfortable with silence, it doesn't automatically mean they're insecure, immature, or afraid of people. There can be many reasons. Sometimes they simply grew up in an environment where silence meant conflict. Maybe when the house became quiet, something unpleasant was about to happen. Maybe parents stopped speaking to each other, maybe someone was angry, maybe the silence was used as punishment, maybe there was tension nobody talked about. Over time, the nervous system can begin associating silence with danger, not consciously. The person may have no idea why quiet rooms make them uneasy, they simply feel it. And this is one of the most interesting things about human behavior. We don't always remember the experiences that taught our bodies how to react. We just carry the reaction forward. So an adult can sit in a perfectly safe room with someone they trust and still feel an urge to break the silence, not because they are trying to be annoying. Because somewhere inside them, quietness may have become associated with uncertainty, and uncertainty can make the brain search for information. That's why you'll sometimes notice people talking more when they're nervous. They tell unnecessary stories. They explain things nobody asked about. They laugh at moments that aren't particularly funny. They keep asking questions. They say things like, so, anyway. They aren't necessarily trying to dominate the conversation. They may simply be trying to reduce the uncertainty created by silence. Words become a kind of psychological flashlight. They use them to illuminate the room, to figure out what's happening, to find out what the other person is thinking, to make the situation feel predictable again. And there's another reason silence can feel threatening. Talking gives us control. When you're speaking, you know what you're doing. You're choosing the words, you're shaping the conversation, you're influencing how the other person sees you. But when you stop talking, you lose some of that control. Now the other person has space to respond, or not respond. They can think, they can observe you, they can simply sit there. And for someone who is highly concerned about how they're perceived, that can be surprisingly uncomfortable, because silence removes the distraction of performance. Think about how different it feels to be alone in a room compared with sitting silently beside someone. When you're alone, silence is usually easy. You don't wonder whether the silence means something, but put another person in the room, and suddenly the quiet has a social meaning. At least that's what the mind assumes. You start wondering whether you should speak. And the other person may be wondering the exact same thing. Now both people are waiting. Neither wants to be the one who breaks the silence. And somehow, 5 seconds can feel like 30. This is why awkward silence is rarely about silence alone. It's often about interpretation. We don't experience reality exactly as it happens. We experience reality through the meaning we give it. And silence is especially easy to misinterpret because it contains so little information. Someone might be quiet because they're tired. Because they're thinking, because they're comfortable, because they don't know what to say, because they're distracted, because they simply enjoy being quiet. But if you already expect something negative, you'll be tempted to choose the negative explanation first. That's where overthinking enters. And once overthinking begins, silence becomes almost impossible to enjoy. The mind starts asking questions faster than reality can answer them. Why aren't they talking? Did I upset them? Are they bored? Do they secretly dislike me? Why did they look away? Why did they pause? And now you're no longer experiencing the moment. You're analyzing it, you're watching yourself from the outside, you're monitoring every word, every facial expression, every pause, every tiny change in tone, and ironically, the more you try to avoid awkwardness, the more awkward you may become, because you're no longer having a conversation, you're managing one. There's a huge difference. A natural conversation has space. People pause, people think, sometimes nobody knows what to say, and that's okay. But when someone believes every quiet moment must be fixed, conversation becomes exhausting. They feel responsible for keeping the emotional temperature of the room comfortable. They feel like if nobody is talking, something must be wrong. This can happen especially often in people who are used to taking responsibility for other people's emotions. If you've spent years trying to keep everyone happy, silence can feel like a problem you need to solve. You notice the mood changing, you immediately want to repair it, you ask what's wrong. You make a joke, you explain yourself, you offer reassurance. You try to bring everything back to normal, but sometimes nothing needs fixing. Sometimes people are simply quiet. And learning to recognize that can be a form of emotional maturity. Because mature communication isn't about eliminating every uncomfortable moment. It's about becoming comfortable enough to let a moment exist without immediately reacting to it. That's a very different kind of confidence. Real confidence isn't always being the most talkative person in the room. Sometimes it's being able to sit quietly without assuming you've done something wrong. It's being able to hear a pause without rushing to fill it. It's allowing another person to think before they respond, and perhaps most importantly, it's being able to hear your own thoughts without immediately drowning them out. Because silence doesn't just reveal how you feel about other people, it reveals how you feel about yourself. This is why some people become extremely uncomfortable when they're alone. There's no conversation to manage, no one to impress, no notification to answer, no distraction to follow, just them. And their own thoughts, and that can be surprisingly difficult. We live in a world where silence is incredibly easy to escape. You can reach for your phone within seconds, open a video, check a message, scroll through social media, put on music, start a conversation. There is always something available to occupy the mind. So many people rarely experience genuine mental quiet. And when quiet finally arrives, it can feel strange. Not necessarily because silence is bad, but because the mind has been running constantly. The first few moments of quiet can bring thoughts you've been avoiding, a relationship you're uncertain about, a decision you've postponed, a conversation you wish had gone differently, a fear you haven't admitted, a question about your own life. Silence doesn't create those thoughts. It simply removes the noise that was keeping you from hearing them. And that's why silence can feel uncomfortable. Sometimes what we're uncomfortable with isn't the absence of sound, it's the presence of ourselves. Think about that. You can spend an entire day surrounded by people, talking, working, scrolling, laughing, answering messages, and still never have a quiet moment in which you actually ask yourself how you're doing. Then the room gets quiet at night, and suddenly, everything you've been avoiding becomes audible. This is one reason people sometimes become addicted to stimulation, not necessarily because they love noise, because quiet gives their thoughts room to surface, and not every thought is pleasant. But here's where we need to be careful. Silence isn't automatically healthy. Being comfortable with silence doesn't mean avoiding communication. There is a difference between peaceful silence and emotional withdrawal. There is a difference between taking a moment to think and deliberately refusing to communicate. There is a difference between having boundaries and using silence to punish someone. That's important because silence can be peaceful, but silence can also be weaponized. Imagine two people in an argument. One says, "I need some time to calm down." "Let's talk later." That's a healthy use of silence. They're creating space so they can respond thoughtfully instead of reacting emotionally. Now imagine someone deliberately ignores another person for days, refuses to explain why, and uses the uncertainty to make the other person anxious. That's something different. The silence is no longer simply space. It's being used as a form of control. And this is why you can't understand someone's behavior simply by looking at whether they are quiet or talkative. You have to look at the intention and the pattern. Silence can communicate respect. It can communicate thoughtfulness. It can communicate discomfort. It can communicate anger. It can communicate indifference. It can communicate peace. The meaning depends on context, and that is exactly why people who fear silence sometimes struggle to interpret it accurately. They may treat every silence as a message, but not every silence is a message. Sometimes, silence is just silence. Someone may pause because they're thinking. Someone may not reply immediately because they're busy. Someone may sit quietly because they feel comfortable enough not to perform. And sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is resist the urge to create a story where there isn't enough information to support one. That's harder than it sounds. Because the human mind prefers certainty, even a painful explanation can sometimes feel better than not knowing. If someone doesn't answer your message, it's tempting to decide they don't care. At least that gives you an answer, but reality may be much more complicated. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe they're distracted, maybe they don't know how to respond, maybe they're dealing with something unrelated to you, maybe they genuinely need space, or maybe they are losing interest. You don't always know. And emotional maturity means being able to tolerate that uncertainty without immediately turning it into a conclusion. This is where silence becomes almost like a psychological mirror. It shows you how quickly you create meaning when information disappears. Some people see silence and think they're angry, others think they're thinking, others think they must be judging me, others think this is peaceful. The silence is the same. The internal story is different, and that story often tells you something about the person interpreting it. Not everything, but something. A person who constantly expects rejection may hear rejection in neutral situations. A person who expects conflict may hear conflict in pauses. A person who feels secure may be more comfortable allowing ambiguity. That's one reason emotional security can change the way social situations feel. When you feel secure, you don't need every moment explained. You can let someone have a quiet afternoon without assuming they are upset with you. You can sit beside someone without constantly performing. You can disagree without believing the relationship is about to collapse. You can hear "I need some time" without immediately interpreting it as abandonment. And that kind of security doesn't mean you never feel anxious. It means you don't automatically obey every anxious interpretation. That's a powerful distinction, because a thought can feel true without being true. Your mind might say something is wrong. You can notice the thought. Without immediately acting on it, you might think this silence feels uncomfortable. And instead of filling it instantly, you can simply let it exist. One breath, then another. Nothing has to happen, and something interesting often happens when you do this. The discomfort rises and then begins to fall. You discover that the silence itself wasn't dangerous. Your anticipation of the silence was. This is one of the quietest forms of personal growth. Learning that you don't have to react to every uncomfortable feeling. You can experience uncertainty without immediately solving it. You can experience awkwardness without escaping it. You can experience silence without turning it into a crisis. And the more comfortable you become with that, the less power silence has over you. There's also something socially fascinating about people who are comfortable with silence. They often make other people feel that they don't need to perform either. Imagine sitting with someone who doesn't panic when conversation stops. They don't immediately grab their phone. They don't start talking just to make noise. They don't ask endless questions. They simply sit there. Maybe they smile, maybe they look around, maybe they continue drinking their coffee. There's something calming about that. It sends an unspoken message. We don't have to entertain each other every second, and that can create a deeper kind of connection. Because genuine closeness isn't measured by how much two people can say. Sometimes it's measured by how comfortable they are when there is nothing to say. Think about the people you're closest to. You may have moments with them where you talk for hours, but you may also sit together doing completely different things and feel perfectly fine. That's not emptiness, that's comfort. When two people don't need constant conversation to prove that the connection is still there, silence stops feeling like a threat. It becomes part of the relationship. And perhaps that's one of the deepest reasons silence makes some people uncomfortable. Because silence removes the reassurance that words normally provide. When people are talking, you receive constant signals. They're smiling, they're responding, they're asking questions, they're laughing, they're saying your name. All of those little signals reassure the brain, we're okay. But when the signals stop, you have to trust what exists underneath them, and trust is difficult when you're not sure you have it. This can explain why silence can feel especially intense in relationships. You might be sitting beside someone you love and notice they're quieter than usual. Immediately, your attention shifts. You start reading their face, their posture, their phone, their tone. You wonder whether they're pulling away, and sometimes the best response isn't to interrogate the silence. It's to communicate directly. You're quieter than usual. Is everything okay? Then listen. Not every quiet moment needs an explanation, but sometimes it does. Healthy communication doesn't mean pretending silence doesn't affect you. It means responding to it without turning your fear into an accusation. There's a difference between saying, "You're being weird, what's wrong with you?" and saying, "I noticed you're quiet, if something's on your mind, I'm here." One creates pressure. The other creates space. And that difference can completely change what happens next, because when people feel pressured to explain every silence, they may become even quieter. But when they feel safe enough to speak when they're ready, they're often more willing to open up. This is another paradox of silence. Sometimes the more desperately you try to force words out of someone, the less they have to say, but when you create enough emotional space, they may finally speak honestly. Silence can give people time to find the words they actually mean, and that's something we often underestimate. Not everyone processes emotions out loud. Some people need to think before they speak. They may understand what they feel only after sitting with it. If you demand an immediate answer, you might get a reaction instead of an honest response. So sometimes silence isn't avoidance. It's processing, and if you don't know which one you're dealing with, you have to look at the pattern. Do they eventually communicate? Do they come back to the conversation? Do they explain what they needed? Do they use silence to regulate themselves? Or do they repeatedly disappear whenever something becomes emotionally difficult? Patterns tell you more than isolated moments. A quiet person isn't necessarily emotionally unavailable. A talkative person isn't necessarily emotionally open. Someone can talk constantly and reveal almost nothing about themselves. Someone else can say very little and still be deeply honest. That's why judging people by how much they speak can be misleading. Some of the most meaningful communication happens in the spaces between words, a pause before an answer, a change in tone. A moment when someone finally stops defending themselves, a quiet room after an argument, a person looking away because they're trying not to cry. Silence can contain emotion. But it doesn't always tell you exactly what the emotion is, and that's where empathy becomes important. Instead of immediately deciding what someone else's silence means, you can become curious. You can ask, you can observe, you can give them room, and you can accept that you might not have the full story. That last part is difficult. We like to believe we're good at reading people. But sometimes what we call intuition is simply familiarity with our own fears. We see something ambiguous, and our mind chooses the interpretation it knows best. If you've been rejected before, you may notice rejection everywhere. If you've been lied to, you may become sensitive to small changes. If you've experienced unpredictable relationships, consistency may feel suspiciously unfamiliar. And if you've lived around conflict, peaceful silence might even feel strange. This is why self-awareness matters. Before asking, "Why are they quiet?" sometimes it's worth asking, "What does their silence make me feel?" That's a different question. And it can reveal much more. Does it make you afraid, unimportant, rejected, angry, curious, peaceful? Do you feel the need to fix the moment? Do you feel responsible for making everyone comfortable? Do you immediately assume you've done something wrong? Those reactions are worth noticing, not because they prove something is wrong with you, but because they may show you where your mind learned to search for danger. And once you notice that pattern, you have a choice. You don't have to eliminate the feeling. You don't have to force yourself to love silence. You simply don't have to let the feeling decide what the silence means. That's a subtle form of freedom. You can sit in an uncomfortable moment without rushing to escape. You can let someone think. You can let yourself think. You can allow a conversation to breathe. And you can discover that not every empty space needs to be filled. Some spaces are where understanding happens. Some are where emotions settle. Some are where people gather the courage to say something honest. And some simply exist. There's a strange pressure in modern life to always be available, always responsive, always entertaining, always communicating. A message arrives, we answer. Someone sends another, we respond. A conversation slows down, we check our phone. The moment becomes quiet, we create noise. Eventually, we can forget what genuine silence feels like, but silence has a way of slowing everything down. It gives you a chance to notice what conversation can hide. What are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are you avoiding? Who are you when nobody is asking anything from you? And maybe that's why silence can be so uncomfortable, because it doesn't give you instructions. It doesn't tell you what to think. It doesn't reassure you. It simply creates space. And what you experience inside that space is often deeply personal. For one person, silence is loneliness. For another, it's freedom. For one person, silence is rejection. For another, it's respect. For one person, silence is punishment. For another, it's peace. The sound is absent, but the meaning is not. And perhaps the real skill isn't learning how to avoid uncomfortable silence. It's learning how to understand what the silence is actually asking of you. Maybe it is asking you to listen. Maybe it's asking you to stop performing. Maybe it's asking you to give someone space. Maybe it's asking you to communicate honestly. Maybe it's asking you to sit with uncertainty, or maybe it's asking you to finally hear yourself. The next time a conversation becomes quiet, notice what happens inside you. Don't immediately reach for your phone. Don't automatically make a joke. Don't assume something is wrong, just notice. Feel the urge to fill the space. Then ask yourself why. What are you afraid might happen if nobody speaks? What story does your mind start creating? What are you trying to control? And what would happen if, for just a moment, you didn't? You might discover something surprisingly simple. Silence wasn't attacking you, it wasn't rejecting you. It wasn't necessarily hiding anything. You were simply uncomfortable with not knowing, and once you become comfortable with not knowing, silence becomes much less frightening. You don't need every pause to have a meaning. You don't need every quiet moment to be repaired. You don't need constant words to prove that you're accepted. Sometimes people are quiet because they're thinking, sometimes because they're tired, sometimes because they're processing, sometimes because they're comfortable. And sometimes, yes, silence does mean something, but you don't have to guess. You can communicate, you can ask, you can listen, and you can give reality the chance to speak for itself. Because the most emotionally secure people aren't necessarily the ones who always know what everyone else is thinking. They're often the ones who can admit, I don't know yet, and remain calm anyway. That's what makes silence powerful. It reveals how much of our discomfort comes not from what is happening, but from the story we create about what is happening. And when you stop needing to fill every silence, you may notice that something else becomes quieter too, the need to be approved of. The need to explain yourself, the need to keep everyone comfortable, the need to know exactly what another person is thinking, and underneath all of that, there can be something surprisingly peaceful. You can simply be there, with another person, with yourself, without performing, without rushing, without filling every empty second with noise. Because sometimes the strongest form of comfort isn't having something to say, it's knowing that you don't have to. And if this changed the way you think about the quiet moments in your life, stay curious about them. Here at NEXMIND Core, we explore the psychology behind the things people experience every day but rarely stop to understand. So the next time a room goes quiet, don't be so quick to break the silence. Listen to what your mind does with it, because sometimes the silence isn't telling you something about the other person. It's showing you something about yourself, and if you're willing to sit with it long enough, you might realize that what once felt uncomfortable was simply an invitation to understand yourself a little more deeply.